the heart of the band. Echo and the Bunnymen stopped itself. That heart and also their foundation had a name, Pete de Freitas. He was the architectural soul who created the rhythm for a generation, the solid granite slab upon which the post-punk cathedral was built. But the man who was the foundation for everyone else had no foundation for himself. On the outside, a master of rhythm. On the inside, a civil war. He was the anchor that kept the band from breaking apart, while he himself was being torn apart from within. This is not the story of an accident. It is the autopsy of a collapse from within. The ruthless tragedy of the load bearer, the man who supported everyone else only to be crushed by the very same weight. To understand the complex, beautiful rhythm that was Pete de Freitas, you first have to understand the conflicting worlds that created him. Our story begins not in the rain-swept streets of Liverpool, but thousands of miles away, under the Caribbean sun, in a world on the cusp of profound change. Peter Louis Vincent de Freitas was born on the 2nd of August, 1961, in Port of Spain, the bustling capital of Trinidad and Tobago. This detail is not just a piece of trivia, it's the secret ingredient, the ghost note in his life's rhythm. In 1961, Trinidad was in its final year as a British colony. The air was thick with the scent of tropical flowers, diesel fumes from the port, and the palpable energy of impending independence. The culture was a rich, intoxicating gumbo of influences, African, Indian, Chinese, Syrian, and European, all simmering together. The rhythm of the island was inescapable. It was in the lilt of the dialects spoken on the streets, in the sizzle of food vendors' stalls, and most of all, in the music. This was the home of calypso, a sound built on intricate, syncopated rhythms and sharp, satirical storytelling. It was the birthplace of the steel pan, an instrument forged from discarded oil drums, a testament to the island's ability to create extraordinary beauty from industrial refuse. This was the sonic landscape of Pete's earliest moments, a world where rhythm was not an academic concept, but the very pulse of life itself. His family was a perfect embodiment of this cultural crossroads. His father, Denis de Freitas, was a distinguished lawyer of Portuguese descent, a man of intellect and precision who represented the unyielding legal framework of the British Commonwealth. His English mother, by contrast, was a homemaker with a deep, intuitive gift for music, a talented amateur who filled the home with melody. In this household, the structured logic of British law coexisted with the innate, fluid pulse of the Caribbean. Pete, along with his 3 siblings, sisters Rose and Rachel, and brother Frank, grew up in a home where 2 distinct worlds were always playing in harmony. It's no coincidence that music was in their bloodline. His brother Frank would go on to become the bassist for the influential group the Wooden Tops, proving the talent was a familial inheritance, not just a hobby within the home. But this idyllic, sun-drenched world was fleeting. In the late 1960s, as part of the great post-colonial migration, the de Freitas family uprooted their lives. They left the vibrant, chaotic warmth of the Caribbean and relocated to England, settling in the genteel, historic county of Somerset, near the elegant Georgian city of Bath. The change could not have been more dramatic. The lush, rolling green hills of the English countryside, often shrouded in a soft, damp mist, were a world away from the tropical energy of Port of Spain. The explosive colors of the island were replaced by 1,000 shades of green and gray. The spontaneous, joyful noise of the streets was replaced by a quiet, pastoral hush. For a young boy whose earliest memories were steeped in a different climate, a different culture, a different rhythm, the shift was profound. It was the first great dislocation of his life, and it was about to be intensified by his education. He was sent to Downside School, a prestigious and notoriously strict Catholic boarding school run by Benedictine monks. If Trinidad was a world of exuberant freedom, Downside was its polar opposite. Founded in the 17th century, it was a bastion of tradition, an institution steeped in centuries of ritual and discipline. Known as the Catholic Eton, it was a place designed to forge young men through a rigorous combination of academic study and spiritual observance. Imagine the silence. The ancient stone walls of the Abbey Church, so vast they could swallow sound whole. Imagine the rigid timetables dictated by the ringing of bells, portioning out the day into periods of prayer, study, and compulsory sport. Imagine the solemnity of the Latin Mass, the scent of old incense clinging to the air, the rows of boys in uniform taught to value conformity, obedience, and quiet contemplation. For a boy with the untamed rhythm of the Caribbean still echoing in his soul, it must have felt like landing on another planet. It was a beautiful atmospheric cage. It was in this very environment of profound restriction that his rebellion began to take shape. It wasn't the loud, aggressive defiance of a punk rocker. Not yet. It was something quieter, more internal. It was a desperate, almost frantic search for an escape valve, a way to release the pressure that was building inside him, and he found it. The legend, as told by his family, is that the spark was lit around the age of 12. His father, perhaps sensing his son's restless spirit, gifted him a small, simple drum kit. That was it. That was the key turning the lock. In the privacy of a dorm room or a designated practice space, the quiet, disciplined world of Downside was suddenly filled with the ghost of another sound, a sound that was loud, visceral, and utterly his own. Pete became a secret scholar of the airwaves. He would tune his radio to the legendary taste-making shows of John Peel on BBC Radio 1, listening with an almost religious intensity to the new, dangerous sounds filtering through the static. This wasn't the polite pop music of the charts. This was the wild frontier, the thunderous polyrhythmic complexity of Led Zeppelin's John Bonham, the chaotic, explosive genius of The Who's Keith Moon. He'd record the shows on cassette tapes, and then, in the precious hours he could find, he would sit behind his kit, headphones clamped over his ears, meticulously trying to deconstruct and replicate the thunder of his rock heroes. He was teaching himself the secret language of the rhythm section, not through formal lessons, but through pure, obsessive immersion. This period is crucial to understanding the musician he would become. He was a self-taught artist, but his education was twofold, a collision of two opposing worlds. From the monks at Downside, he absorbed a sense of structure, discipline, and a profound appreciation for atmosphere, for the power of sound filling a large, empty space like the Abbey Church. He learned the value of precision, of control, of knowing when not to play. From the radio, he absorbed the raw, untamed energy of rock and roll, the joy of pure physical expression, the power of a beat that could move a body and a soul. This fusion, the sacred and the profane, the disciplined and the wild, the architectural and the tribal, would become the very essence of his unique drumming style. As he moved through his teenage years, this energy found an outlet beyond his headphones. He joined a series of schoolboy bands, playing local gigs at school dances and village halls around Somerset. He was learning his trade, developing a reputation as a drummer of uncommon power and flair. And then, in 1976, the world caught fire. The Sex Pistols and The Clash detonated the punk rock bomb in London, and the shock waves ripped through the placid English countryside, reaching all the way to the ancient stone walls of Downside School. For Pete de Freitas, punk wasn't just a new style of music. It was a validation. It was a cultural permission slip. It was a movement that celebrated raw energy over technical perfection, instinct over training, rebellion over conformity. It was everything he felt stirring inside him, given a voice and a three-chord soundtrack. The frantic, minimalist drumming of punk was another piece of the puzzle, another color added to his increasingly sophisticated palette. The pull was now irresistible. The path his family and his school had laid out for him, a life of quiet professional respectability, now seemed utterly alien, a future he could not and would not accept. In 1978, at the age of 17, Pete de Freitas made the decision that would define his life. He walked away from downside school, away from the rolling hills of Somerset, and headed north. He wasn't running away from something so much as he was running toward something. He was chasing a sound, a feeling, a destiny. His destination was not London, which was the epicenter of the punk explosion but was already becoming a commercialized, media-saturated scene. He chose Liverpool. It was a city in the midst of its own creative renaissance, a place where the energy of punk was mutating into something more atmospheric, more artistic, more melancholy. It was the cold industrial heart of the post-punk movement, and it was there, in the city's decaying, magnificent grandeur, that he would find the three other young men with whom he was destined to make history. He was no longer just a boy from two worlds. He was about to become the heartbeat of a new one. But a heartbeat needs a body. A rhythm needs a soul to move. The Liverpool that awaited Pete de Freitas was not just a collection of streets and buildings. It was a living, breathing organism, a city of beautiful ghosts and ferocious creativity, with its own unique melancholic pulse. It was a scene that had a space waiting to be filled, a silence ready to be broken by a new kind of beat. When Pete de Freitas arrived in Liverpool in 1978, he stepped into a city of beautiful ghosts. This was not the vibrant pop art Liverpool of the Beatles, a city basking in the glow of global fame. This was a place haunted by its own magnificent past. The post-industrial decline of the 1970s had left behind a landscape of stunning, decaying Victorian architecture, a sense of profound melancholy that hung in the damp air blowing in from the Irish Sea. The city felt grand and forgotten all at once. And it was this very atmosphere, this blend of faded grandeur and gritty reality, that made Liverpool the perfect breeding ground for post-punk. While London's punk scene was a snarling, nihilistic explosion, Liverpool's response was more artistic, more introspective, more poetic. It was a scene that valued mood and texture as much as raw energy. And the epicenter of this new universe, the crucible, where the city's creative soul was being forged anew every single night, was a legendary, sweaty basement club on Matthew Street called Eric's. Eric's Club wasn't just a venue. It was a laboratory, a university of the underground. Down a dark flight of stairs in a room that smelled perpetually of stale beer, sweat, and ambition, the future of music was being mapped out. It was a community where musicians, poets, and artists gathered, not just to perform, but to argue, to collaborate, and to dream. This was the world that had spawned bands like the Teardrop Explodes and figures like the eccentric genius Julian Cope. It was a place that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the corporate music industry in London. It was an island unto itself. And it was here, in this fertile, shadowy world, that a new band still in its infancy was making a name for itself. They were a trio of young men bound by a shared love of the Velvet Underground, David Bowie, and 60s psychedelia, and a ferocious, almost arrogant self-belief. They called themselves Echo and the Bunnymen. The lineup was a study in contrast. There was the frontman, Ian McCulloch, a man armed with a poet's soul, a razor-sharp wit, and a voice that could shift from a mournful croon to a defiant roar. He was the magnetic, charismatic, and often dictatorial center of the storm. Then there was the guitarist, Will Sargent, the enigmatic architect of their sound, a man who seemed to coax noises from his guitar that no one had ever heard before, spidery, shimmering, jagged textures that painted landscapes rather than just playing riffs. And on bass there was Les Pattinson, the stoic, silent anchor whose melodic, driving bass lines were the bedrock upon which the others built their sonic cathedrals. They had a sound, a swirling, psychedelic, and jaggedly poetic noise. They had an image, all cheekbones, greatcoats, and moody intensity. But they were missing a crucial element. In their earliest gigs, their rhythm section was a fourth member they sarcastically nicknamed Echo, a cheap, tinny-sounding drum machine. It was cold, metronomic, and lifeless. Ian McCulloch would later describe its sound, in his typically blunt fashion, as simply shite. The machine could provide a pulse, but it was holding them back. They needed a human heart. They needed a soul. Through the city's small, tightly connected music scene, a world where everyone knew everyone, the young Pete de Freitas, then 17 going on 18, was introduced to the band in early 1979. The connection was immediate. They saw in him not just a drummer of astonishing power and technical skill, but a kindred spirit, intelligent, quietly confident, and carrying an explosive energy just beneath the surface. He understood their influences, their ambition, and most importantly, he knew that rhythm wasn't just about keeping time. It was about building an atmosphere. The audition was less a tryout than a coronation. Pete joined the band, and the drum machine was unceremoniously kicked to the curb. On October 25, 1979, opening for the Cramps at Eric's Club, the new four-piece took to the stage for their first gig with Pete de Freitas. For those packed into that cramped basement, it was the stuff of legend. The moment he sat behind the kit and launched into their first song, everything changed. The cold, mechanical pulse of Echo was replaced by something living, breathing, and powerful. Pete's style was immediately distinct. It wasn't the frantic, snare-heavy attack of punk, nor the straightforward 4/4 backbeat of traditional rock. It was deeper, darker, more resonant. He leaned heavily on his toms, using them not just for fills, but as the backbone of his patterns, a rolling tribal thunder that gave their sound vastness and cinematic weight. It was the perfect rhythmic counterpart to Will Sargent's spectral guitar and McCulloch's poetic croon. That night at Eric's, the band didn't just sound better. They sounded whole. They sounded dangerous. They had found their heartbeat. This period was Pete's real education. The discipline of downside school met the chaotic freedom of Eric's Club. He was a sponge, absorbing everything around him. He idolized the inventive, powerful drumming of Budgie from Susie and the Banshees, another post-punk pioneer who used the drums as a melodic lead instrument, a source of color and texture. But Pete filtered these influences through his own unique sensibilities, his own internal rhythm, creating a style that was both muscular and agile. He could conjure a storm of primal power and then, in an instant, pull back to a whisper of delicate cymbal work. The band's rise from this point was swift and certain. They were signed by Bill Drummond and David Balfe to their influential independent label, Zoo Records, the epicenter of the Liverpool scene. After releasing their debut single, they were quickly snapped up by a major label affiliate, Korova. The momentum was building. The buzz was deafening. In July 1980, after honing their sound through relentless gigging, they released their debut album, Crocodiles. Crocodiles was a stunning statement of intent. From the opening urgent beat of the title track, Pete de Freitas' presence is the undeniable driving force. The album is a masterpiece of youthful, nervous energy. It's dark but not bleak. It's aggressive but also melodic and intelligent. And Pete's drumming is the frantic, beautiful engine at its core. Listen to the iconic tom-tom pattern that introduces Rescue, the band's first hit single. It's not just an intro, it's a call to arms, a sound of tense, nervous anticipation that perfectly mirrors the song's lyrical themes of anxiety and salvation. On Villiers Terrace, Obey's drumming is a kinetic, restless shuffle, pushing the song forward with a relentless, almost paranoid momentum. On Pride, it's a powerful martial stomp, a display of pure, confident power. A review in the NME at the time praised the album's sense of epic drama, a quality that came directly from the architectural, almost cinematic quality of Pete's rhythms. The album was a critical triumph, a blast of fresh, dark air that cut through the musical landscape. It cracked the UK Top 20, and the notoriously discerning NME named it one of their albums of the year. The Bunnymen had arrived, and their rhythmic soul was a key reason why. With the album's success came their first taste of life on the road. The early tours were a trial by fire, the classic story of a young band finding its identity in the cramped, claustrophobic confines of a Ford Transit van. They were a gang, a tight-knit unit of 4 very different personalities, bound together by a shared ambition and the exhilarating, terrifying reality of their sudden success. Will Sargent, in his memoirs, paints a vivid picture of these days. The endless motorways, the cheap bed and breakfasts, the backstage camaraderie, and the inevitable arguments. And at the center of it, Pete was often the calm in the storm, the easygoing, smiling presence who could diffuse the tension between his more volatile bandmates. But behind the radiant smile was a musician of fierce, almost obsessive dedication. It was during this time that a fascinating, little-known quirk of his emerged. Consumed with the need to perfect his craft, he would sometimes, on a day off or with his own money, record his drum tracks or new ideas under the pseudonym Louis Vincent, his 2 middle names. This wasn't about creating a side project or hiding his identity. It was a private ritual. It was a way of stepping outside of Pete de Freitas, the Bunnymen drummer, to critically assess his own playing, to experiment with new patterns, and to push himself to be better, away from the prying eyes and ears of the band. It was a sign of the dedicated, almost academic seriousness with which he approached his art, a trait that would define his entire tragically short career. By the end of 1980, they were a national phenomenon, a band on the cusp of true greatness. They had found their sound, their audience, and with Pete de Freitas, they had finally found their center. The foundation was laid, but what they would build upon it would exceed even their own wildest ambitions, an ascent into the heavens of rock and roll that would be as beautiful and as brilliant as it was ultimately dangerous. The band was now a fully formed weapon, armed with a sound, an image, and a devastatingly powerful rhythmic engine. They were ready to conquer the world, but the world they were about to conquer was a nation in turmoil, a Britain of stark gray realities and simmering discontent. In this fractured landscape, music wasn't just an escape, it was a necessity. And Echo and the Bunnymen were about to provide the perfect, poetic soundtrack for a generation's anxiety. The dawn of the 1980s in Britain was not a celebration, it was a reckoning. The optimistic, multicolored hangover of the 60s had given way to a stark, brutalist reality. The nation was a pressure cooker of social and economic unrest. Under the uncompromising leadership of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, Industry was being dismantled, communities were being fractured, and for a generation of young people, the future looked less like a promise and more like a threat. The air was thick with a sense of conflict, a feeling that the old world was being torn down, with no clear blueprint for what would replace it. And in music, this feeling found its voice. The initial explosive burst of punk rock had splintered into 1,000 different shards. What emerged from the fallout was post-punk, a genre that took punk's raw energy and filtered it through a lens of anxiety, intellect, and artistic ambition. This was not music of simple three-chord rebellion. This was the sound of introspection, of doubt, of beauty found in the shadows. And as 1981 began, no band embodied this dark, romantic, and dangerously intelligent spirit more completely than Echo and the Bunnymen. They had conquered the underground with crocodiles. They had established themselves as the critical darlings of a new era. But now they stood on the edge of something far greater. The world was holding its breath, and the Bunnymen were about to provide the soundtrack for its anxious, uncertain exhale. In May of 1981, Echo and the Bunnymen unleashed their second album, Heaven Up Here. The title itself was a typically audacious statement, a declaration of their soaring ambition. But if the title suggested an ascent into the light, the music told a different story. This was a darker, denser, and far more challenging record than its predecessor. The nervous, youthful energy of Crocodiles had been replaced by a sense of foreboding, a mature, muscular power. It was the sound of a band no longer knocking on the door, but kicking it off its hinges. And the engine driving this new, formidable machine was Pete de Freitas. His playing on Heaven Up Here was a quantum leap forward. It was a performance that moved him from the ranks of great young drummers into the territory of a true virtuoso. This was not just drumming, it was orchestration. He was using his kit to create texture, atmosphere, and a profound sense of drama. Listen to the album's opening track, Show of Strength. Pete's beat is not a straightforward rhythm. It's a relentless rolling tide of tom-toms and crashing cymbals, a maelstrom of sound that perfectly mirrors the song's themes of power and confrontation. Then, on the iconic single, A Promise, his drumming is a masterclass in tension and release. The beat is a tight Marshall snare pattern, full of military precision, but it's the spaces he leaves, the moments of near silence before the chorus explodes, that give the song its unbearable heart-in-your-throat tension. But it was on the album's epic 6-minute centerpiece, Over the Wall, that Pete's genius was laid bare. The track is a frantic, paranoid journey, and his drumming is the narrative guide. He builds layers upon layers of intricate tribal tom patterns, creating a sound that feels both ancient and futuristic. It's a performance of incredible stamina and imagination, a maelstrom of rhythm that propels the song into a state of hypnotic, terrifying ecstasy. It was playing like this that solidified his reputation as an innovator, a drummer who thought less like a timekeeper and more like a composer. The critics were unanimous in their praise. The album was hailed as a masterpiece of modern rock, a dark, brilliant reflection of the times. It stormed into the UK top 10, and for the second year in a row, the hugely influential NME crowned their record the Album of the Year. The Bunnymen were no longer just a great band. They were the voice of a mood, a generation. With this new level of fame came a new level of pressure. Their live shows became legendary events, rituals of sound and light where the band would push themselves to the absolute brink, often draped in camouflage netting, shrouded in smoke and backlit like mysterious otherworldly figures. Pete, with his radiant smile and the explosive, coiled spring energy of his playing was a mesmerizing presence on stage. He was the anchor of their chaos, the solid, joyful center of their dark, swirling universe. But the relentless cycle of touring began to take its toll. The long hours on the road, the adrenaline of the performance followed by the profound emptiness of a hotel room in a faceless city. It was a disorienting, draining lifestyle. For a young man who was by all accounts sensitive and thoughtful underneath the rock star exterior, it was a difficult world to navigate. And like so many musicians before and after him, Pete began to rely on alcohol to bridge the gap between the exhilarating highs and the crushing lows. It started innocuously, a few beers to unwind after a show, a way to lubricate the social machinery of life on the road, but it would slowly, insidiously cast a long and devastating shadow over his life. After the triumphant success of Heaven Up Here, the band should have been on top of the world. Instead, they nearly fell apart. The recording sessions for their third album, 1983's Porcupine, were notoriously fraught with tension. The band was exhausted, creatively drained, and the close quarters of the studio became a crucible for their conflicting egos and artistic visions. The sessions were reportedly so difficult that the band's label initially rejected the album, sending them back to the drawing board. It was out of this turmoil, this near collapse, that they produced one of their most powerful and successful records. Porcupine is the sound of a band at war with itself, and the result is thrillingly tense and confrontational. The album's string arrangements, which added a new layer of dramatic, almost cinematic scope to their sound, were a key part of its brilliance. And Pete's role in shaping this new direction was crucial. His keen melodic and harmonic sense meant he was now an integral part of the songwriting and arranging process. He wasn't just the drummer. He was a sonic architect, pushing the band towards a grander, more epic sound. His drumming on the album is a testament to his growing sophistication. On the hit single, The Cutter, his beat is a powerful, almost militaristic march, driving the song with an unstoppable force. But it's the intricate, syncopated patterns he plays on the hi-hat, a subtle, skittering counter rhythm that gives the track its unique, edgy brilliance. On The Back of Love, he unleashes a torrent of explosive fills, a display of pure power and technical virtuosity that was a direct challenge to the more restrained, minimalist drumming of many of his post-punk peers. Porcupine was a massive commercial success, reaching an astonishing number 2 on the UK charts, kept from the top spot only by Michael Jackson's Thriller. They were now undeniably one of the biggest bands in the world. But the success only amplified the internal pressures. The creative friction that had once been productive was now threatening to tear them apart. The dynamic within the band was famously complex. The relationship between the fiercely opinionated, often abrasive Ian McCulloch and the quietly determined, musically sophisticated Pete de Freitas was at the heart of their creative fire. They were brothers in arms, but they were also rivals. Two brilliant musical minds often pulling in opposite directions. McCulloch was the poet and the frontman, protective of the band's image and lyrical vision. Pete was the musical purist and the restless experimenter, always pushing to expand their sonic palette. For a time, this clash pushed each other to greater heights, but as the pressures of fame grew, the cracks began to show. It was during this period of intense creativity and turmoil that Pete's Louis Vincent pseudonym made its only official public appearance. In 1982, in a move that spoke to his deep love for the Liverpool music scene, he lent his immense talents to another seminal local band, the Wild Swans. He played drums on their legendary and influential single, the revolutionary spirit. It's a masterpiece of melancholic, beautiful pop, and Pete's drumming is its gentle, insistent heart. The credit on the record sleeve reads simply, Louis Vincent. It was a quiet nod to his own private world, a rare public glimpse of the man who, even at the height of his fame, was still that studious boy from Downside, obsessed with the pure craft of his instrument. After the tense, claustrophobic sessions for Porcupine, the band knew they needed to do something different. They needed to escape, to dream again. Their vision for their fourth album was their most ambitious yet. It would be a record of dark, romantic grandeur, a symphony of melancholia. It would be, as they famously and audaciously declared to the press before a single note had been recorded, the greatest album ever made. The album would be called Ocean Rain. To achieve this vision, they left the familiar confines of their Liverpool studio and relocated to Paris. They recorded with a full 35-piece orchestra, a move that could have been disastrously pretentious in lesser hands. The idea to incorporate such a sweeping classical arrangement is widely credited as being championed by Pete de Freitas. He heard the potential for something vast and timeless in their music, a fusion of their post-punk edge with the emotional power of a film score. Ocean Rain, released in 1984, was the moment their ambition and their talent perfectly aligned. It is a masterpiece, an album that sounds like it was recorded not in a studio, but in a vast underwater ballroom. And Pete's performance on the record is breathtaking. It is the work of a master painter who has put away the broad, aggressive strokes and is now using the finest of brushes. His drumming is subtle, nuanced, and deeply, profoundly emotional. He uses mallets, brushes, and bare hands to create textures of incredible delicacy. On a track like Seven Seas, his rhythm is a light, joyful skip, a perfect counterpoint to the song's whimsical, psychedelic melody. On the title track, his drumming is a slow, majestic procession, the sound of a great ship sailing into a mysterious fog. And then there is The Killing Moon, the song that would become their calling card, their stairway to heaven, a timeless anthem of fate and desire that would appear in countless films and television shows, most famously in the opening scene of the cult classic film Donnie Darko. That song is simply unimaginable without Pete de Freitas. The gentle, insistent, hypnotic pulse of his tom-toms is the song's very soul. It's not a beat, it's a narrative, a quiet, powerful story being told with sticks and skins. It's the sound of a heart beating in the darkness, waiting for destiny to arrive. It is, quite simply, one of the most perfect and iconic drum performances in the history of rock music. Ocean Rain was their crowning achievement, the moment they transcended the confines of post-punk and created a work of pure, timeless art. It cemented Pete's reputation among his peers as one of the truly great drummers of his time. He was the engine behind the band's entire artistic transition, the rhythmic framework upon which Will Sargent could hang his shimmering guitar textures, and Ian McCulloch could drape his poetic visions. He was the undisputed, albeit often unsung hero of their sound. But the view from the top of this artistic Olympus was dizzying, and the man who had orchestrated this majestic, beautiful sound was beginning to feel the ground crumble beneath his feet. They had reached the summit. With Ocean Rain, they had created their magnum opus, a timeless monument to their artistic vision. From the outside, they were untouchable, the kings of their genre, their faces staring out from the covers of magazines around the world. But victory can be a desolate landscape, and the view from the top can be terrifyingly lonely. The very success they had fought for had become a golden cage, and for the man who was its very heartbeat, the pressure was becoming unsustainable. The year 1985 should have been a victory lap for Echo and the Bunnymen. They had achieved the seemingly impossible. They had emerged from the jagged, monochrome world of post-punk and created a work of lush, timeless beauty with Ocean Rain. They were at the absolute peak of their creative and commercial powers, revered by critics as artistic visionaries and adored by a global fan base that treated their concerts like religious gatherings. They had conquered the world on their own uncompromising terms. They were, by any measure, one of the most important bands on the planet. And from his throne behind the drum kit, Pete de Freitas was the architect of this grand sound, the unwavering heartbeat of their majestic, melancholic universe. So, the question that would echo through the music press and fan communities for years to come was as simple as it was baffling. Why would anyone walk away from this? Why would a king, at the very moment of his coronation, choose to abdicate his throne and vanish into the wilderness? The answer was not simple, and it was not a single event. It was a slow erosion, a quiet crumbling of the foundations that had held him up. The relentless 5-year cycle of record tour record had taken a profound toll. The internal machine of the band, which had once run on a volatile but productive fuel of creative friction, was now grinding to a halt. The arguments over musical direction, the claustrophobia of life in a creative bubble, the sheer physical and mental exhaustion of the road, it had all become unbearable. For Pete de Freitas, the music, which had once been a glorious escape, was starting to feel like the very cage he had fled downside school to avoid. In early 1985, he did the unthinkable. He quit Echo and the Bunnymen. The decision sent shockwaves through their fan base and the music industry. It seemed incomprehensible, an act of career suicide. But for Pete, it was an act of desperate self-preservation. He needed to escape the suffocating pressure, the artistic compromises, and the lifestyle that was slowly poisoning him. He needed to breathe. He needed to find out who he was outside of the monolithic shadow of the band he had helped build. And so he ran. He fled the gray, familiar skies of England for a time, chasing warmth and freedom across the Atlantic. He drifted through America for a few months, soaking in the humid, vibrant, chaotic pulse of New Orleans, a city whose heartbeat seemed carved from rhythm itself. The choice of destination was telling. He wasn't drawn to the slick machinery of New York or Los Angeles, where he could have capitalized on his fame. He sought a place that moved differently, a city steeped in musical tradition, bursting with sound and ghosts, utterly unlike the cool, atmospheric music he had helped to define. But New Orleans was less a new home than a creative pilgrimage. Pete wandered there, listening, absorbing, thinking. He was searching for a new sound, a new identity, a new life. The city's blend of jazz, blues, and funk seemed to promise some kind of rebirth, a rhythm that might reignite what had dimmed under the relentless demands of being a Bunnyman. Yet after the haze of travel and inspiration, he returned to England, restless, full of sketches and half-formed ideas. Back home, he set those ideas into motion. Drawing from his fascination with spontaneity and groove, he assembled a loose, free-spirited band he christened the Sex Gods. The very name was a declaration of intent, a two-fingered salute to the serious, poetic image of his former group. The concept was to create an unguarded, impulsive collective, a space for raw energy and experiment, far removed from the meticulous architecture of the Bunnymen. He poured his hopes into it, writing new material and recording a handful of demos in small English studios. Among collectors, those tapes have become rare curiosities, fleeting glimpses of what might have been, a fascinating collision of his powerful rock drumming with looser blues-tinted rhythms. But the project was perhaps doomed from the start. Plagued by unstable lineups and a lack of clear direction, the Sex Gods struggled to find their footing. Pete, for all his musical brilliance, was not a born band leader like Ian McCulloch. He was a collaborator, a creative catalyst, not an authoritarian visionary. The freedom he had long craved proved to be its own kind of trap. Without the structure and friction of the Bunnymen, the project lost momentum. After just a few months of chaotic, inspired but ultimately fruitless sessions, the Sex Gods collapsed. Pete, the man who had been the rhythmic anchor for one of Britain's most visionary bands, now found himself adrift again, a gifted musician alone in the aftermath of his own search for liberation. This period was a turning point not just for Pete, but for the musical landscape itself. By 1985, the dark, atmospheric post-punk that he had helped to define was beginning to fade from the mainstream. The charts were dominated by the bright, synthesized sounds of synth pop and the stadium-sized ambitions of new wave. The alternative rock scene was still a nascent underground movement. Pete was a man out of time, a musical purist trying to find his place in a world that was increasingly drawn to artifice and polish. The pressure of his past success was a heavy burden. He wasn't just another musician starting a band. He was Pete de Freitas of Echo and the Bunnymen, and the weight of that legacy was crushing. His struggles with alcohol, which had begun as a coping mechanism on the road, now escalated dramatically. In the lonely, unstructured days and long, humid nights of New Orleans, drinking became less a social habit and more a desperate form of self-medication. It was a way to numb the pain of his creative frustrations, his growing sense of failure, and a profound, disorienting isolation. Friends from that period would later recall a man of stunning contradictions. He was still brilliant, still capable of lighting up a room with his fierce intelligence and infectious charm. But they also saw a new fragility, a sadness that clung to him like the Mississippi fog. As one later put it, he was still luminous behind a drum kit, a god of rhythm the moment he picked up his sticks. But the light was beginning to flicker and fade when the music stopped. The old creative friction with Ian McCulloch was now seen in a new, more poignant light. It wasn't just about artistic differences, it was a fundamental clash of philosophies. McCulloch, for all his artistic pretensions, had a keen, almost ruthless sense of the Bunnymen's brand, the mythos they had so carefully constructed. Pete was the restless experimenter, the musical purist who wanted to tear down the temple and build something new, to chase the pure, unadulterated thrill of creation without regard for image or expectation. His departure had been a desperate bid for that freedom, but that freedom, when he finally found it, proved to be a terrifying, empty void. After the collapse of the Sex Gods, and nearly 2 years in the wilderness, a defeated but not entirely broken Pete de Freitas returned to England in 1986. It was not a triumphant homecoming. It was a quiet retreat. He returned to his roots in the Liverpool scene. But now, as an outsider, a guest in the world he had once ruled, he became a sought-after session drummer, his immense talent still revered by his peers. He lent his skills to a number of independent projects. A king without a kingdom, but a king nonetheless. He was a man in exile, grappling with the wreckage of his ambitions. And it was during this period of personal and professional limbo that a new, unexpected light entered his life. He met and fell in love with a woman named Gianna Sacco. Their relationship provided a desperately needed anchor in the storm of his life. It was a source of stability, of normality, of a kind of peace he hadn't known since his earliest days. Together they built a new life, and their daughter, Lucy Marie, was born in 1988. This new chapter seemed to represent a different path, a chance to rebuild his life away from the destructive machinery of the music industry. For a man who had spent his life feeling like an outsider, the experience of becoming a husband and a father was profoundly grounding. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a glimpse of a different future, a different version of himself. It was a brief, beautiful moment of peace, but it was the final moment of calm before the last great storm of his life returned to claim him. For a brief, beautiful moment, it seemed that Pete de Freitas might have found a separate peace. As a husband and a father, he had a new anchor in a world that had always threatened to sweep him away. But the ghost of his past life was never far away. The band he had abandoned was now adrift, a ship without a rudder, lost in a sea of changing musical tides. A reunion felt both inevitable and dangerous, a final desperate attempt to recapture a magic that for Pete had come at a terrible price. By early 1987, the musical world that Echo and the Bunnymen had helped to create had moved on. The dark, atmospheric grandeur of post-punk had been largely replaced by the polished sheen of synth pop and the jangly, intellectual sounds of what was now being called alternative rock, a scene dominated by bands like the Smiths and REM. In this new landscape, the Bunnymen found themselves in a precarious state. They had continued on after Pete's departure, hiring a new drummer, the former haircut 100 member Mark Fox. But the chemistry was wrong. The magic was gone. The band that had once felt like a force of nature now seemed adrift. Their live shows lacked the old fire. The intricate, powerful rhythm that had been their signature was replaced by something more conventional, more straightforward. The soul was missing. The band, his musical brothers, knew it. The fans knew it. The critics knew it. And so, an invitation was extended across the fractured landscape of their brotherhood. They needed their heartbeat back. They asked Pete de Freitas to come home. He accepted, but the reunion was not a simple, triumphant comeback. It was a fragile, cautious negotiation. The man who returned to the band was not a returning king, but a ghost haunting the ruins of his own kingdom. He was scarred by his time in the wilderness, by the failure of his own ambitions and the deepening grip of his personal demons. He rejoined as a full member for the recording sessions of their 5th studio album. The recording sessions for the self-titled album, Echo and the Bunnymen, were reportedly a world away from the chaotic, inspired energy of their early days. The atmosphere was tense, professional, and fraught with unspoken history. The old fractures within the band remained, papered over by the demands of the recording process, but never truly healed. The production was slick, handled by Laurie Latham, known for his polished work with artists like Paul Young. The goal was clear: to create a record that could compete in the lucrative American alternative rock market. Yet despite the turmoil and the new glossy sonic environment, the moment Pete de Freitas sat behind the kit, something of the old magic returned. His presence was instantly felt, a jolt of life into a body that had been on life support. The rhythmic soul of the band was back. He played on the majority of the album's tracks, and his signature style, though perhaps more restrained, is unmistakable. The album saw post-punk fully transform into what would be known as alternative rock, and Pete's drumming was the perfect bridge between the two eras. It had the dark, atmospheric weight of their past, but with a new power and studio precision that pointed towards the future. Listen to the album's biggest hit, the iconic Lips Like Sugar. Pete's beat is not the sprawling tribal assault of his earlier work. It's a tight, powerful, and incredibly danceable groove. It's sophisticated, controlled, And yet, underneath it all, you can still hear that unique melodic flair. The way he uses his cymbals and toms to add color and emotion. On the album's other standout single, The Driving Bedbugs and Ballyhoo, the old fire is there, a powerful, propulsive performance that reminds the world why he was so irreplaceable. The album was a huge commercial success, reaching number 4 on the UK charts and giving the band significant airplay in America. On the surface, it was a triumphant return to form. The Bunnymen had weathered the storm and reasserted their relevance. But this success was a heartbreaking paradox. The band's heartbeat was growing stronger and louder on the airwaves, while the heart of the man who created it was quietly, inexorably failing. The man who returned to the band was a ghost of his former self. His time in the wilderness had taken a profound toll. His physical health was deteriorating, a visible manifestation of his long battle with alcohol. The internal band tensions, though managed in the professional environment of the studio, still simmered. Ian McCulloch later gave a heartbreakingly astute description of Pete during this time, a quote that perfectly encapsulates the tragic paradox of his friend's personality. Pete was the kind of person who would light up everything and everyone around him, but he always burned himself first. He was still the life of the party, the man with the radiant smile and the wicked sense of humor, but the party was killing him. A crucial, often overlooked aspect of his struggle was his mental health. Close friends and family would later speak of a man who, especially in these final years, suffered from severe bouts of anxiety and debilitating depression. In an era when mental health was still a deeply misunderstood and taboo subject, particularly in the macho, hedonistic world of rock and roll, these struggles went largely unnamed and untreated. There were no therapists on tour, no public conversations about the psychological pressures of fame. He was the anchor of the band, a rock-solid foundation for everyone else. Yet he himself was a man completely adrift on a storm-tossed internal sea. His return to the band was a double-edged sword. Musically, it helped restore their integrity and produced a brilliant album. But personally, it threw him back into the very lifestyle, the pressures of recording, the demands of promotion, the prospect of touring that had broken him in the first place. He was a ghost haunting his own life, a man going through the motions, his legendary smile now often masking a deep and profound sadness. The joy of his marriage and the birth of his newborn daughter, Lucy Marie, was a powerful beacon of light in his life. It was a source of immense love and a reason to hope. But it was a light that struggled to penetrate the all-consuming darkness of the illness that had taken root in his soul. The band had its heartbeat back, but it was a heart that was tragically, irrevocably broken. The machine was running again. The charts were conquered once more, but the man in the engine room was running on fumes. He was a ghost at his own feast, physically present, but spiritually fading. His life had become a tightrope walk between the profound love he felt for his new family and the profound despair that his illness inflicted upon him. Every day was a battle, a fragile negotiation between light and darkness, a state of being that could not hold forever. The spring of 1989 was a time of profound and fragile contradictions for Pete de Freitas. On one hand, there was a glimmer of hope, a new and powerful reason to live. He was a husband and a new father. The love for his wife and his baby daughter, Lucy Marie, was a powerful anchor, a connection to a world beyond the chaos and noise of the rock and roll life. It was a chance for a new beginning, a quiet domestic peace that had always seemed out of reach. On the other hand, the ghosts of the past were ever present. He was back in the orbit of the band he had tried to escape, caught once again in the machinery of recording, promotion, and the looming prospect of touring. His physical health was precarious, his spirit worn down by a long, silent war with anxiety, depression, and the alcoholism that had been his constant, treacherous companion for a decade. He was a man pulled in two opposite directions, torn between the gentle hope of a new life and the powerful gravitational pull of his own self-destruction. His life was a constant commute between these two poles, splitting his time between his family in Liverpool and the demands of the music business in London. On June 14, 1989, he was making that familiar journey. He was riding his motorcycle, a powerful 900cc Ducati, a machine that was the perfect physical embodiment of his drumming style, sleek, powerful, and dangerously fast. He was on the A51 road in Longden Green, Staffordshire, a winding stretch of English country road, riding his motorcycle on the A51 road in Longden Green, Staffordshire. It was a journey he had made countless times before, but this time he would not complete it. In a horrifying, random, and brutally mundane moment, a car collided with his motorcycle. Pete was thrown from the bike. He died instantly at the scene. Peter Louis Vincent de Freitas was 27 years old. Pete de Freitas, the drummer for Echo and the Bunnymen, died tragically at 27 in a motorcycle accident, his sudden death marking a devastating entry into the 27 Club. His passing was a fatal blow to the band. Described by bandmate Ian McCulloch as the heartbeat of everything we did, Pete's absence ripped the soul out of the group. They attempted to continue but quickly disbanded, bringing their golden era to an abrupt end. Even when they reformed years later, the void he left behind remained a profound and irreplaceable presence. De Freitas' legacy is twofold. He was a musical innovator and a cautionary tale. As a musician, he was a key architect of the post-punk sound, transforming the drums from a mere timekeeping device into a lead, melodic, and emotional instrument, earning him the title the Keith Moon of post-punk. As a cautionary tale, he is the ultimate tragedy of the load-bearer, the man who served as the unwavering foundation for a magnificent cathedral of sound, only to be crushed by the very weight he so masterfully supported. Today, Pete's legacy is fiercely preserved by his bandmates, family, and fans. His grave has become a site of pilgrimage, and his music continues to be celebrated, cementing his genius. More than just a drummer, Pete embodied the post-punk spirit, explosive, creative, and uncompromising. The rhythm he created both in his life and his art endures as a powerful, complex, and unforgettable beat that echoes eternally in his timeless music.